I request you to go for the lunch, and all the participants, please come back at 1:15 for the evaluation.
Sorry? It's not me. I have to keep you all awake. I can stay awake. Okay. So I want to start by just recapping what we've covered so far. Okay? So we talked last time about a number of these disorders, a category of sleep disorder called circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders. We talked about how they're classified. Some of them are caused by disruption of the circadian timing system in some way that is a chronic, recurrent kind of pattern. Some of them are caused by externally imposed disruption, like shift work and jet lag. All of them result in common symptoms. What are some of the symptoms of circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders? What are the common complaints? Low mood, daytime sleepiness, tiredness, fatigue, anxiety,
eating pattern also disturbs.
Sorry?
Pattern also
Eating, gastrointestinal disruption,
And some metabolic disorders.
metabolic disorders, stress. What about sleep?
Sleep quality reduces.
So insomnia. So the two diagnostic criteria, or the two symptoms that give rise to these diagnostic criteria, are typically sleepiness and sleep disturbance, insomnia. However, all the other things you described, stress, anxiety, metabolic disturbance, etc., are really the things that drive people to come to get help. Okay? So what we're going to be talking about now is how to treat these conditions, and that's going to lead me to a more detailed discussion about melatonin. And I'm going to use melatonin as an example of how we're leveraging a powerful chronobiotic to be able to treat circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders. And now many other conditions as well, because we know that disruption of the circadian timing system doesn't just happen in sleep disorders, it happens in, and as we've heard from Professor Murray, for example, it happens in a number of mood disturbances as well, or mood disorders. So to give you some kind of overarching principles, remember last lecture we talked about the fact that the melatonin rhythm is often used as a marker of the sleep. To move the clock earlier in time because it's abnormally delayed, or we want to move the clock later in time because it's abnormally advanced. Now, I'm not sure if, I know Till Ronenberg covered phase response curves. So it's really critical to understand this concept as a chronobiologist. This is one of the fundamental properties of circadian pacemakers. And let me take you through briefly, I don't have time to go through it in detail, but I'm happy over the next day and a half to talk in more detail about it. The basic property of a circadian oscillator is that it is differentially sensitive to the zeitgeist, depending on the time or phase at which it's exposed to the zeitgeist. So let's start with light. Here we have circadian time. We call it circadian time because it's time according to the internal clock, not time according to the external environment, because we've learned now that there are marked differences between individuals in how they train and so on. So what's relevant is what time it is according to the central clock in the brain. So that's called circadian time. And this grey bar represents approximately the sleep episode, what time it would be, and 0 here represents the time of minimum of core body temperature in the middle of the night or late in the night. Now what this graph shows is that as you expose the person to light, what happens to their circadian phase? Does it move earlier, or does it move later, or does it stay the same? And you can see there are some times of the day where there's 0 effect on phase if you expose the person to light. Then there are some times of the day, like here, which would be approximately early into the sleep episode. If you expose the person to light there, you shift their clock much later in time, in a westward direction, as though you're flying west. Then, if you expose the person to light early in the morning hours, you shift the clock earlier in time. You cause a phase advance of the clock. Now, every Zeitgeber has its own phase response curve. And I told you in the last lecture that people are differentially sensitive to light, for example, and presumably other Zeitgebers as well, which means that every person probably has their own kind of fingerprint of a phase response curve. Some will show large responses, some will show small, some will show larger delays than advances, etc. But this gives you an average of how a human responds. Very similar to how rodents respond. Their phase response curve to light will look very similar. I mentioned that every Zeitgeber has its own characteristics phase response curve. So if you administer melatonin, now you've got to switch your mind because we've been talking about melatonin being a phase marker. Now we're going to suddenly go to melatonin being given exogenously, given as a drug, effectively, right? Because I'm going to talk to you in a little while about how it can be used to shift the circadian clock as well. Okay, so just note that difference. So when you administer melatonin as a drug, in a form of a capsule, for example, you can cause phase shifts of the pacemaker. You can cause phase advances if it's administered kind of in the evening and afternoon hours. And then it pretty much causes no phase shifts right through the day, through the night. And then in the early morning hours, there's some evidence that it can cause a delay. Very different to the light phase response curve. What else can you see that's quite different between the two phase? Well, what are some of the different characteristics of the two phase response curves?
Yeah, just inverse to opposite phase.
Inverse, so I'm going to first deal with one, amplitude. So tell me more about that, Gaurav. What do you see different?
The effect of light is more than
Excellent. The inverse relationship, what can you see?
If there is delay in case of light, but in melatonin, it started advancing. It advances the clock at the particular time, that is at -8 CT.
Low amplitude, we covered that, and the timing. So, for example, the time at which light is inducing its maximum phase advances, melatonin is, inducing modest phase delays, the opposite effect. So there's kind of like an almost inverse phase relationship between the two phase response curves. And the amplitude difference is really important because ultimately this really drills home the point that light is the major Zeitgeber for human circadian pacemaker and for mammals, right? These are fairly modest effects, but they help us to sometimes illustrate the typical entrainment to a light-dark cycle. The grey bars represent sleep, so assume this person is is literally going to sleep like clockwork at midnight and waking up at 8 o'clock in the morning. We would call this person entrained with 0 phase angle difference. As it gets dark, sleep onset occurs. So that's what is referred to here as normal entrainment. And here are some examples of all of these conditions that we looked at in the last lecture. Entrained with a delayed phase, that is, the sleep-wake cycle occurs several hours after the onset of darkness. Entrained with an advanced phase, and then in blindness we talked about this condition where either the sleep-wake cycle or the endogenous circadian clock free runs. So let's think about what some of the interventions are. And in delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, what tends to happen is that the person has to wake up in time to go to school or work, which then causes this pattern of chronic sleep restriction. They're woken up at a time where, remember I was telling you, it's like telling the parents, it's like waking you up at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's very challenging over several days for this to happen. So in order for you to correct the abnormal delay in delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, you need to phase advance the clock, right, to correct the abnormal delay. So the first thing you might do is give melatonin, because remember in the phase response curve, that time of day of administration of melatonin should result in a phase advance of the clock. And in the advanced phase, you want to do the opposite. You want to delay. And in the free running example, you want to entrain the system. You want to kind of lock it on to a 24-hour cycle. This, I should have mentioned last time, is a condition that was originally described because a lot of blind people you see it in, but increasingly in the circadian clinics around the world, people with a number of other psychiatric conditions are presenting with this free running pattern. And Greg and Sean, I don't know if you've come across this, but you know, schizophrenia and so on, you are seeing increasingly people free running. And so the free running can be well treated with something like this, where you're giving a single entraining stimulus every day. So that's melatonin. What about if we try a combination of melatonin and light? So if it's a delayed sleep-wake phase disorder patient, you want to give melatonin at this time to advance the clock, and remember, morning light advances the clock. So you might administer both of those treatments in parallel. And then the opposite is the case for the advanced sleep-wake phase disorder. Now, obviously, in a blind person, there is no point in also administering light therapy, but you might, if it's a type of patient that I mentioned that has, for example, schizophrenia or something like that, you would probably use the melatonin therapy as well as enhancing the light-dark to try and keep them, at least behaviorally, synchronized for 24 hours. So these are the kind of principles that are used by clinicians to try and treat the circadian rhythm, the classic circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders that we described.
Sorry, are they have the effect of synergy or this?
Are they synergistic, the effects? They are they're additive,
Yeah.
because there isn't really an interaction between the pharmacological melatonin dose and the light effect, but they are additive in the sense that they contribute to a bigger treatment effect.
And there is no role of light in freelance.
If the person's blind,
The light is
not of any use, but if the person is a sighted non-24 hour, yes, absolutely, there is a role of light.
So just out of interest, Shanta, following up on that question, have people made phase response curves for the combination of melatonin and light? Because that's
No.
really what we're talking about, isn't it?
No, they haven't. I mean, no.
Because theoretically you could make one, couldn't you?
And it's interesting, Greg, because historically medicine looked at single
Yeah,
treatments
yeah.
and tested them as single treatments efficacy. But in clinical practice, rarely do you just try one thing,
Yeah.
right? You usually combine things because you want a bigger bang for buck.
Yeah.
So it's a good experiment to think of. So there are some treatment guidelines that have been published by a number of well-known people in the field as to when to administer light therapy, when to administer melatonin therapy, and so on. So I won't spend very long on this, but I'll share the slide so you can look at the references as well in more detail. And there's lots of, or there's an increasing amount of work being done where there's, for example, meta-analyses that have been done looking at the evidence for and the quality of the evidence for various things like light therapy for advanced sleep-wake, delayed sleep-wake, etc. You'll see that really what we need is bigger trials because the quality of evidence, it tends to be low, and the direction and the strength of the effect tends to be low because these trials tend to be small. Now I'll pick up on that in a moment and tell you what we're doing about that as well. Now shift work is complicated, and I'm going to be giving a whole lecture on shift work tomorrow. But just to give you an idea of what is recommended for shift workers, the first thing that's recommended is discuss elimination of shift work. The second is that initiate regular assessments of a number of outcomes that we know are at risk in these patients or these individuals. Mood, cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal, and cancer all should be monitored in these patients regularly. Sleep-related comorbidities, that is sleep apnea, insomnia, should be screened regularly. And other potential comorbidities. So heightened vigilance as a clinician, because this group of patients, this group of individuals is at high risk of a number of conditions. Then you should develop an individualized or personalized treatment plan for the individual. And then finally, you should look at all of the other social factors that are also likely to be contributing to the stress and so on that this person is experiencing. So what does this personalized treatment plan look like? Well, imagine that the person is working has 2 days off on Saturday and Sunday, and then starts 5 night shifts. The arrows represent the time at which core body temperature would be at a minimum. That's another marker of the circadian clock, remember. So the first thing to do is to place sleep appropriately, to give them a sleep plan. So the first few days, the suggestion is that the sleep plan should be effectively a split sleep, because it's difficult during the day to achieve a full 8-hour bout of sleep. So what the experts recommend, and we recommend, is to break it up into 2 bouts, because you sleep for 4 to 6 hours, and then wake up, have a meal, etc., and then have a nap before you start work. And then you can predict where core body temperature is as it adjusts to this new schedule as well. Then you can administer a whole bunch of things to try and treat the symptoms of sleepiness. So bright light is recommended, caffeine is recommended, and you can also try modafinil as well for short-term use, and it's here, the S is for modafinil, is because of the fact that after the 3 consecutive night shifts, the 4th and 5th the person is at particular risk of impaired sleepiness. So these authors from the US recommend using modafinil, particularly as the sleepiness continues to increase. And melatonin, the M is for melatonin, and here is the dark glasses, but melatonin here will facilitate the sleep and also help to delay the clock.
So how many hours before sleep that they have administered the melatonin?
It should be, in this case, fairly close to, it can be, usually we say half an hour before, because the T max of melatonin is about half an hour. So about half an hour before the person is asleep. I'm going to skip over this, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about, so one of the things that we have done at Monash, for example, is recognizing that there needs to be much greater focus on clinical management of these sorts of conditions. We developed a clinic that's specializing in certain types of sleep disorder, insomnia that Sean covered this morning, and all of the circadian rhythm sleep-wake. So we're training PhD students and clinical students in the management, medical students in the management of these conditions. We also, I told you that the level of evidence is weak at the moment. For large trials are needed, multinational trials are needed. So the other major initiative that we've been working on over the last year is to form an international association of circadian health clinics. I spoke to Professor Verma about it would be terrific to have an Indian circadian health clinic that joins this network. And so at the moment we have a working group that brings all of these groups together from the United States, Europe, Japan, and Australia. And our goal is to improve health through the development, assessment, and implementation of evidence-based personal care for patients with any conditional disease of the circadian system or associated with disruption of the circadian system. And it's involved, that the organisation will involve clinicians, educators, and researchers in the fields of circadian science, biological rhythms, and sleep medicine. It should be incorporated very soon, and it'll be open for membership as well. And so clinics can join and individuals can join as well. And the idea is to really foster standardized treatment approaches for circadian health disorders. And there's a website, if you look for International Association of Circadian Health Clinics, you'll find the website for it. All right, I'm going to move to talking in more detail now about melatonin. But before I do that, are there any questions that anyone would like to ask about this first, kind of the principles around treatment of circadian rhythm sleep disorders?
So how many minutes of phase advance you expect by melatonin? Because I can read
By melatonin?
Yeah.
Between half an hour to 45 minutes.
Because if you remember, the AV almost went through his melatonin response.
Because of the protocol.
Because of the protocol.
Yeah, that's why that whole issue of delays is a bit controversial, because really we're not sure if the protocol was not good, and we're not sure if that really is whether melatonin in humans really induces delays.
So, why do you think that the melatonin is doing phase advance later at night? Because during during the daytime there is no detectable melatonin, right, in the blood. When you are showing that there is a phase advance.
It could be, because if you look at the rat SCN slice preparation that Martha Gillette
Yeah.
has used as her model. It's an in vitro, they take slices of the hypothalamus in the rat that contain the SCM, they put it into a bath, they measure, they take electrophysiological recordings from the hypothalamic slice, and then they expose the slice to melatonin at different phases. And they find that there are 2 phases that the rat SCM is sensitive to, around dusk and around dawn. Now, behaviorally, they don't actually respond to the dawn one, but the dusk one, they respond behaviorally. So it could be a little bit like what Eric Herzog was talking about in terms of a 2 oscillator. We don't know. But it's still unsure, and I would not recommend melatonin in the morning because it also causes sleepiness. So it's not a great thing to give to the patient in the morning. It's a weak Zeitgeber to phase delay. You give light really to phase delay. That's a much more powerful stimulus.
What is the need for giving the 2 Zeitgebers, melatonin as well as light? Is it more effective than melatonin alone or light alone?
Look, I think Greg Murray asked the question, has there been a phase response curve combining them? There hasn't. But the trials suggest that it's more efficacious to combine.
When you withdraw the melatonin, what happens with the endogestation of melatonin?
Nothing. There's been a lot of work on whether there is some kind of downregulation and all of these things, and there really is no evidence of that. So there isn't any kind of permanent change in endogenous.
And what happens whether also there's another important hormone other than related
So there are some positive other effects. So there are for example, antioxidant effects we were talking about at lunchtime of melatonin that you could possibly harness and use in neurodegenerative disease, etc. In terms of the adverse effects, all of the meta-analyses suggest that the only adverse effects of melatonin are increased sleepiness, occasional headache, and there is some anecdotal evidence that people have more vivid nightmares. Now, we're not sure what that means and whether it really is a physiological mechanism or anything like that. It's not a big, vivid dreams and nightmares. It's not something that we would really think is some reason to stop the treatment. So it's safe and well tolerated. It's increasingly used in pediatric populations. There is some concern that it may interact with reproductive development. But when I talk to pediatricians, they tell me that of the options available, everything else, the benzodiazepines and so on, have greater adverse effects and risks with pediatric populations, so they still prefer to use melatonin.
Sorry, 2 silly questions. So first is, if the light has more effect in amplitude, why still clinicians prefer melatonin, except for the ease? And second question is, can a company patent light therapy? Because we see this is going on trials. So can a company, patent light therapy as such?
So the first question, why use melatonin and light? I think, firstly, I'm going to show you in a moment that melatonin does more than shift the clock. It also has a direct effect on sleep. So, in humans. So, therefore, it is useful to use together because it achieves the desired effect of improving sleep, and in combination with light can increase the phase shifting effect. I think also, I don't have any evidence for this, but in my trials, I find that light therapy on its own, it's difficult to get people to comply. But when you combine it with the pharmacological therapy, like melatonin, it's easier to change behavior. People seem to be, unfortunately, more primed to get a treatment in the form of a capsule than simply in light therapy. The second question, can people patent light? Yes, they can, and they have. And so universities have patented light and its applications, the applications of light.
Pattern when the light should be given. That is.
Algorithms, spectral composition of the light. There are patents internationally. Okay, so I want to acknowledge and dedicate this discussion on melatonin to one of the forefathers, Stuart Armstrong, who died late last year. And Stuart did the pioneering work, which I'm going to show you in a moment, that really kind of shocked the field, because prior to his work, 40 years ago exactly this year, we thought that the mammalian circadian system was relatively impervious to any other stimulus except light. We just thought mammals are different and we are not sensitive to anything else. And Stuart's work demonstrated this shocking kind of finding that melatonin can actually entrain the rat circadian system. So, and Jenny Redman was my PhD supervisor as well, so I worked closely with this team. So this was the classic experiment that led to the non-24-hour melatonin study I'm talking about. You have rats that are free running. So here is the wheel running activity rhythm of a rat in constant darkness, and it shows this free running pattern. At this point in the experiment, you give daily injections, pharmacological injections of melatonin to the rat, and at a particular point in the experiment, the activity rhythm locks on to the entraining stimulus. I think it was Shipra that talked about when you demonstrate with this true entrainment, the classic paradigm is then you take away the entraining stimulus and you look at where the phase of the rhythm is that comes afterwards. And you can see that there is clear entrainment of this compared to the control injected, the vehicle injected animals which don't entrain. Now, I'm going to just very briefly talk about the fact that around this time, a lot of work was done to see, well, where is this effect coming from? And the first thing that was done was, well, let's lesion the SCN in rats. And so the SCN was lesioned to render the animal arrhythmic behaviorally, and then daily injections of melatonin were given. And there was no synchronization of the activity rhythm in the absence of the SCN. This was the experiment I was telling you about from Martha Gillette's lab, which then showed that, if you keep the SCN slice preparation in vitro and record neuronal firing rhythms, you can shift the timing of the firing rhythm administration at CT10 and CT23. CT12 is the onset of activity for a nocturnal animal, right? It's the beginning of the biological night. So CT10 is about 2 hours before the onset of activity. If you administer melatonin at around that time, you induce a phase advance of the SCN firing rhythm. CT23 is the one that I was telling you earlier is dawn, early morning, at the end of the biological night. And you can induce a phase advance at that time as well. Now, there are several other lines of evidence that shows that melatonin affects the SCN as well, including altering the rhythm of CFOS expression in the SCN, etc.
Yeah, but we did find this business.
You did find this?
We did not find it. I spent a year finding out if the CFOS and melatonin relations. So we published the negative papers in the same journal.
As the
Thomas Kilda. And he was probably the reviewer. And we were asked, then rejoinder Verma's approach, that if there was a paper getting 200 citations every year and findings were not correct, I think this itself qualifies our paper to be accepted. And we got acceptance within 2 hours. So this is both Grant and Golden Hamster picture. I mean, I myself tried. So I spent a whole year just googling himself, first replicating himself and then advancing to could replicate himself.
Well, that's really interesting, and it's a good.
Obviously, 97.
97.
Yeah.
It's a good illustration to you of how science works as well. So then the other major developments in the field of melatonin was the cloning of the melatonin receptor and identification of two subtypes, the melatonin 1A or MT1 and melatonin 1B or MT2 receptor. And a lot of work was done, which I'm not going to go into in detail, to try and see whether there was a difference in the role of MT1 and MT2. It looks like both are involved in, I mean, there was one hypothesis that maybe one is involved in the sleep promoting effect and one is involved in the circadian phase shifting effect. It hasn't really stood, you know, it hasn't been convincingly demonstrated that there really is a separate role of the two receptors, subtypes. In my PhD, I kind of carried on this work with Jenny Redman, and we worked with a diurnal rodent that you must be all very familiar with because it comes from this wonderful country, the Indian palm squirrel. And so the British, in their wisdom, decided when they colonized Australia that our animals didn't look very interesting. So they took the Indian palm squirrel from one colony and they released it in Australia in another colony to say, let's have some squirrels here. And so fortunately, this squirrel, unlike the fox and the rabbit and everything that was introduced to Australia, which has gone, you know, created incredible agricultural problems, this one hasn't. It's not a very strong species to survive in that environment. But it is wild outside Perth Zoo here, this part of Australia. And so we got these trapped. It's a strongly diurnal rodent. You can see the light-dark cycle and its strong diurnal pattern of entrainment. And what I had to do was, because I couldn't inject the wild-caught animals, I had to give melatonin in their food every day in this paradigm. And I found that melatonin administered at ZT12 could cause the activity rhythm to remain synchronized during the period of administration. So it shifted the clock in the diurnal rodent as well. I then went to the University of Surrey, and I mentioned to you yesterday, or the day before yesterday, these experiments that were done in this environment where people had to come and live there for 14 days, and I got this overwhelming response from the population to participate in my study. Let me tell you about the protocol. Firstly, the participant came in and slept in the lab from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. at their normal bedtime for 8 hours. Then they participated in a 30-hour constant routine. What's the purpose of that? Why do we do constant routines? Evaluate the endogenous rhythm. We want to get a baseline assessment of the endogenous rhythms, right? So we did a constant routine. Then we put them into this light-dark cycle where they went to bed every day at 4 p.m. and they woke up and they got out of bed at 8 a.m. 16 hours in bed. So what we had effectively was an extended sleep and a phase advanced, and it was also phase advanced. It was occurring now at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Very difficult. You can imagine that if in 1.5 hours you were put to bed for 16 hours, it's quite difficult to sleep for that long. And what we did was we worked with the formulation of melatonin that came from a drug company that we worked with in the UK that produced this surge sustained release formulation. And this is what it looked like, that you administer the melatonin and it elevates plasma levels. So 1.5 milligrams, you can see, is elevating plasma levels, you know, almost 10 times what the physiological melatonin profile looks like, just with a small dose like 1.5 milligrams. And what it did was it caused plasma levels to remain elevated, which is what we wanted, until the endogenous levels rose. This is the placebo condition, and you can see in black what the endogenous profile of melatonin looks like. So that was the protocol, and we got participants to come back twice. Once they received melatonin at this time just before their 16 hours in bed, and once on the separate time they received placebo, and it was randomized crossover. So what did we find? Now, this is a way in which you can represent sleep in terms of the propensity for sleep across time. So the color contour plot, we're measuring sleep efficiency. So what that means is each of these patients or participants are wired up for polysomnographic sleep recordings that I described yesterday, EEG, EMG, and so on. The sleep is scored to determine what stage of sleep they're in and whether they're awake or asleep. And then I convert those data into a variable called sleep efficiency, which Sean Drummond talked about earlier in the context of insomnia. Except what I've done is every hour of the sleep episode, I've looked at what the percentage of time that they were asleep. And then I plotted it according to this color contour plot, where red represents very high sleep efficiency and purple represents virtually no sleep. And so you can see what the pattern on average looks like. The first night, remember, they were sleeping from 11 p.m. till about 7 or 8 a.m. And it's, you know, pretty well consolidated sleep. The next day, why is it purple all the way across? Because they're in a constant routine. That was a trick question, just to make sure you're all paying attention. They're awake, obviously, and so, but we scored their EEG just to make sure they weren't drifting off to sleep, and of course they are all awake. Then, on the first 16-hour sleep episode, why do you think there's this bout of sleep there? Homeostatic sleep pressure, excellent. Because they've been sleep deprived for 30 hours. As soon as you say, right, you can go to sleep, they've got high sleep pressure, they go straight to sleep, right? And it's fairly high sleep efficiency. But eventually they wake up, and then they're struggling for the rest of the night to sleep because this homeostatic sleep pressure has dissipated. Then every night after that, and this is with placebo, right? So they're not receiving any pharmacological treatment. They have a little bit of sleep, so they're highly motivated to sleep. It's so boring for 16 hours to be lying in bed. No books before the days of iPads or anything like that. So they have to just lie in bed. And so they're highly motivated, so they sleep a little bit, a bit of a nap, and then they wake up and they're awake for a long period of time. And the major sleep bout still occurs in the second half of the sleep episode. All right, so are you ready to see what happens with melatonin? Now, what do you see that has changed? It's a complete reversal of the profile of sleep. Now, the majority of the sleep is occurring in the first half. Then they're awake for a few hours, and then there's a short bout of sleep towards the end. The melatonin has completely altered the distribution of sleep, the timing, and the distribution of sleep.
Was there an effect on duration or quality?
No, there wasn't an effect on duration, and there was no change in the quality of sleep. It was the timing of sleep. Now, these are the circadian rhythms, for example, that we monitor. And you can see that the circadian clock in the placebo condition, the first The open circle represents the first constant routine, the black circle represents the second one. Sorry, the other way around. The black represents the first one, the open circles represents the second constant routine after the several days of exposure to the changed light-dark cycle. What do you see that happened in the placebo condition?
Phase advanced.
Excellent. Phase advanced. So it has, why do you think in a placebo condition there's a phase advance?
There comes a bit of change in amplitude in melatonin.
A slight change, I would
I
say.
don't know if it is significant.
Yeah. It looks like a slight change.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's a phase advance? What has changed in the between the two? What were they exposed to? And altered what? An altered photo view, right? Because they were put to bed for 16 hours, lights were turned off, and they were, the light-dark cycle was phase advanced in order to achieve this 16 hours. So because the light-dark cycle was phase advanced, the circadian clock has phase advanced in response. But with melatonin, what do you see that's
So
different?
was there any experiment in which light-dark cycle wasn't changed? I mean, sleep duration. So, because that would answer
If it's the
if
light.
your interpretation is correct.
There has, I guess the forced desynchrony would be the only one where you're not entraining the circadian clock. And
No, what I'm saying is the explanation you gave because you changed the light dark. But I'm saying if you would have not have 16 hours, because that's the explanation. But
if you don't change, the problem
let's say
with
have
the
it
human,
done 12.
the problem with the human studies
Yeah.
is that, actually I'll show you in the next one where we don't do 16 hours, we just do phase advance. All these other rhythms showed us, sorry, the melatonin condition, what did we see? More phase advance.
Larger.
Yes, it caused a larger phase advance. It wasn't a significant difference in amplitude, I now know, I remember that. There was no change in mesor or amplitude of any of these rhythms. The only one that changed was the temperature rhythm. The temperature rhythm, there was a change in the mesor and the amplitude after the change in photoperiod. Now, I'm going to move through and we can talk about the temperature effect in a little while. Now, what this experiment showed, we were able to look at sleep efficiency. So this is, remember, the percentage of sleep per hour recorded by polysomnography during the placebo treatment versus during the melatonin treatment. And so you can see that there is this massive increase, the red increase, it shows the treatment effect, the direct effect on sleep. And we can also look at the phase shifting effect of melatonin on the sleep cycle, because we can look on the day after treatment stopped, when there was no more melatonin in the system, how does the sleep-wake cycle's timing look? And you can see after melatonin treatment, there is this much earlier rise in sleep compared to in the placebo condition. So this experiment demonstrated these dual effects of melatonin. It is a powerful sleep-promoting compound when it's given outside the normal biological night, when it's given, for example, during the daytime. And that's why Sean Drummond was saying it's not very good for insomnia, because it's being given in the biological night when the pineal gland is already secreting melatonin. But when it's given during the afternoon, like in this experiment, it's a powerful sleep-promoting hormone. And it also shifts the circadian clock. And that's to answer your question about why you would give it, because it happens to give both of those benefits. And just to show you that effect, This was a study by James Wyatt. It was a forced desynchrony study at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And so remember the forced desynchrony protocol, they administered melatonin every day, and they found sleep efficiency improved with melatonin treatment only when melatonin was given during the biological day, that is, during the time when endogenous levels were low. So, whereas when endogenous levels were high, there was no difference between melatonin treatment and placebo. So that's that effect that in a typical insomnia patient, you're not going to get really any benefit if you're giving melatonin at night in terms of the effect on sleep. But if the circadian clock is misaligned in some way, you're going to get a benefit. And that's why you have to choose the patient group carefully when you're going to administer a melatonin treatment and decide which patient the treatment is appropriate for. How are we doing for time? About 15 minutes. Okay. So let me tell you about some of the pharmaceutical developments in the field. A number of melatonin agonists, that is, synthetic versions of melatonin, are being developed. Now you may ask why. One of the primary reasons is because in the United States, melatonin is not classed as a medicine. It's not regulated by the FDA. Therefore, it's very difficult to, you can't prescribe melatonin and you can't use it easily for medicinal purposes because the compound is not readily available in pharmaceutical grade with quality assurance and all of those things. So a number of companies have worked to develop melatonin agonists.
The first one is from Serbia, France, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's what I worked for a year.
Wow. This is like a walk through memory lane for Vinod as well. Agamelatin was developed by Serbia, and it still is.
It didn't have name there.
Yes, it was just S20098. That was the compound.
Yeah, that's
Just to add, Shanta, it's got 4-5-HT effects in melatonin, agamelatin. Quite a lot of, it's a very effective 5-HT agonist. Antagonist.
Now, that's an interesting one, Sri, because the company, so it's a melatonin agonist, and it's a 5-HT2C antagonist.
Yeah.
I am told by the pharmacologists that the 5-HT2C activity is reasonably low because the company decided, they started developing it as a chronobiotic probably the time that Vinod was working there. And I think it was a commercial decision to develop it as an antidepressant. So that's what it was developed as, an antidepressant. And I think it was a commercial decision, just bigger market. And that's why people are skeptical about whether the action is really through the serotonin effect or is it through the...
I think now it's not used because it's got some serious liver issues if you use it.
Yes.
It's got serious liver tox.
Yeah. So there are these adverse effects that were reported, but it's still used here. We were talking about Dr.
It's
Sri.
still available.
Still available.
Yeah, it's not prescribed widely
Yeah.
because it was never a very good, very powerful antidepressant as compared to its peers.
Yeah.
So,
And I think it wasn't a very powerful antidepressant because of the fact that it was acting via the melatonin mechanism, and that will only affect some patients, right? The ones that have some misalignment issue or some circadian issue. Because as we heard from Greg yesterday, the word depression is really a heterogeneous kind of condition of which there are lots of subtypes.
Santa, the interesting part was that it was the year 95-96. So there was Chinese postdoc as well. You begin science chapter, you see there were things like that. So he used to show positive data in vivo with the help of recordings that we last week. And I was having all the data as negative. So it was a kind of very interesting situation.
Yes.
Is it documented that this drug works via MT1 or MT2?
Excellent question. All of them are dual MT1 and MT2 receptors. They have, some of them have differential MT1, MT2 receptor affinity. I can't quite remember exactly for this one, and this one. Tazameltian is the one that I've worked on most, and it's approximately equal affinity to the two receptors. There aren't any, as far as I'm aware, melatonin agonists that just target one. Now that's an argument why melatonin agonists were developed, because pharmacologically it was thought, well, maybe we can target one of the receptor subtypes and maybe it'll be powerful as a phase shifting agent and not a sleep promoter. But that hasn't happened yet. So as I said, I have worked quite a bit on the melatonin agonist tazameltian, and this is the protocol that I mentioned, that we did a similar thing to what we did, and just so that you're, just because I want to break out in a story. So what happened was I'd done my postdoc at the University of Surrey, and this particular pharmaceutical company, Vanda, in the United States, were interested in developing a melatonin agonist. And they heard about the trial I'd done at Surrey in the UK, and they persuaded me to move to the United States, even though I was dead against it. I was happy to go back to Australia and live happily ever after, but they persuaded me to move. And so I moved to the Brigham and Women's Hospital where we did these trials. And so, and it was really the right decision, because I was able to see my work continue into an FDA-approved treatment, which was exciting, because rarely do you see it going from animal work into humans and then into clinical trial. So this was the protocol. We had participants coming in for 3 nights, sleeping at the normal time, given placebo before they slept, a constant posture protocol just to assess Dilmo, and then we gave the randomized treatment for 3 nights after the sleep-wake cycle had been phase advanced by 5 hours. And so that was the protocol, and this was the result. So this is the placebo condition, again with sleep efficiency shown using this color contour. Sleep well consolidated in the first baseline, and then when it was phase advanced in TD1, which is treatment day 1, treatment day 2, and treatment day 3, what do you see happening with sleep efficiency?
It's getting better.
It gets better over time, good, over the 3 days. What else do you see? What happens on treatment day 1? It's disrupted, right? It's showing low sleep efficiency, about 50% sleep efficiency. In the middle, they seem to have difficulty falling asleep as well. So with increasing doses of, so we tested 4 doses of the melatonin agonist, tazameltian, and what do you see with increasing doses of the melatonin agonist?
Efficiency increased in day 1.
I can't hear from one person,
Yes,
can I have?
it's resonating.
Sleep efficiency
Increases throughout the day 1, day 3.
Yeah, it's getting better, and to the point where with 100 milligrams, there's really no difference to baseline, right? They're phase advancing the sleep-wake cycle, and you're able to restore sleep to what it was when you're sleeping at the appropriate phase, providing strong evidence that melatonin is really this kind of signal internally of internal time, and therefore when you shift the sleep-wake cycle, you can almost artificially create the internal environment with the melatonin agonist that's conducive to sleep. And this gives you an idea of the traditional measures of sleep that we use, that when you phase advance the sleep-wake cycle, you increase the latency to sleep onset, how long it takes you to fall asleep, but then with the melatonin agonist, you completely correct that. Similarly with total sleep time, you reduce it when you phase advanced sleep, but there's a dose-dependent improvement with the melatonin agonist. And wakefulness in sleep shows the same pattern.
Shift the light,
Yes.
and you also given that number for 3 days.
3 days, correct.
Next one.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to just point this one out as well as further kind of corroborating evidence that you've shifted the clock. Remember how yesterday I was telling you, or day before yesterday, I was telling you with the forced desynchrony protocol, what did I tell you about REM sleep and whether it was under more circadian control or homeostatic control? What do you remember of that? Homeostatic? REM was under homeostatic. It was non-REM under homeostatic, and REM was more under circadian control. And because REM sleep is under more circadian control, we were interested in whether REM sleep, the rhythm of REM sleep, was also shifted by the treatment. And what we found is that on treatment day 1, you can see that REM sleep is suppressed after the sleep-wake cycle is advanced. This is the baseline day. This is treatment day 1. And over time, it corrects itself. But with the increasing doses of the melatonin agonist, you can see that the REM rhythm is not suppressed on the first day, providing further evidence that the central circadian clock is actually advanced. And this was really exciting because we're giving a melatonin agonist. We can actually measure the melatonin rhythm at the same time using a mass spec kind of approach. And so this was the day, the baseline day. Then the next day we gave the melatonin agonist and we continued to measure the melatonin rhythm. And we found that the melatonin rhythm is immediately phase advanced on the day, the first day that it's administered. So that was exciting because we know the central clock is shifted immediately, the SCM clock, as indicated by the melatonin rhythm. Now, Steve Lockley took this work to the blind patients, and he tested tasimelteon in, and I showed you these kind of raster plots last time, where you've got blind patients who sleep, they attempt to keep on a 24-hour schedule, but their circadian melatonin rhythm is free running. And then with daily administration of tasimelteon, he was able to entrain a proportion of the patients compared to the placebo condition. Now these trials led to FDA approving the melatonin agonist tasimelteon at 20 milligrams at the lowest effective dose in 5 years ago, or sorry, nearly 8 or 9 years ago. And it was importantly the first circadian regulator that the FDA approved to manipulate the circadian system, and remains the only one that it is approved.
Shanta, I just need to highlight, I have a conflict here because we are working in similar area, but the drug failed the primary endpoint. It was no different to placebo. Only 1/5 of the patient in trial responded to the trial. The FDA approved because there was nothing else.
Because of?
There is no other alternative, right?
They approved because technically, so as Sri is saying, this trial initially was designed to test entrainment as the primary endpoint. Only 20% of the patients entrained. Now, the FDA in the end said they didn't want entrainment as the primary endpoint. They wanted all of the sleep outcomes as the primary endpoint, because the FDA, it's a long discussion, maybe we can have it at some point, but it's interesting for you all, because what the FDA says is that entrainment, the circadian mechanism, is interesting, but it's not clinically relevant.
But Shanta, do you think 1/5 of entrainment is good enough? Do you think? When you say the drug is meant for entrainment.
I don't think 1/5 is good enough. And I think there must be lots of reasons why, because in rats, it's 100% entrainment, with melatonin.
No, I absolutely accept. I'm not
So it
questioning.
must be a protocol issue.
Oh, it's not melatonin. This is not melatonin. They
No, it's
never
not.
tested melatonin.
Yeah.
I'm not questioning melatonin because there's lots of
Actually,
data.
it's interesting because, of course, they have tested melatonin. Al Louis has tested melatonin, Steve Lockley has tested melatonin, and you get a much higher proportion of melatonin.
Yeah.
Good points for
By the way, we work a lot together. We don't hate each other. But
we work a lot together on hopefully a new treatment. Just to show you that we have brought the work, when I published that work, even the Lancet said the same thing. Why can't you do this with melatonin? So I came back to Australia and I worked with Tracy Sletton, who is in my group, to do a trial of melatonin for delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. And I promise this is the last trial I'm going to be talking about. So delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, I told you it's this delayed pattern of sleep. We recruited 180 odd patients. We brought them into a protocol in which we administered melatonin for 5 consecutive nights, 0.5 milligrams, a very low dose. And we asked them to take it 1 hour before the desired bedtime for 4 weeks, for at least 5 nights a week. And we found robust effects on the primary outcomes, which were sleep onset, sleep efficiency in the first tertile, and also sleep onset latency. We also found effects on what they call the PROMIS, which is a patient-reported instrument, subjective impairments in daytime functioning, and also in terms of their subjective sleep quality. Over every week of the treatment, we found improvements with the melatonin intervention. We measured the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, the Insomnia Severity Index as validated instruments of sleep disturbance, and found significant improvements with melatonin. And importantly, at the beginning and the end of the trial, we had a sleep physician assess the patient to assess the severity of their symptoms. So the sleep physician was obviously blind as to whether they're taking melatonin or placebo. And we found a significant improvement or rating of improvement by the clinician in the melatonin treated group. So we had significant improvements in patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, and also actigraphic outcomes, objective. So this was pretty clear evidence that melatonin is an effective treatment for delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. It's the largest trial now that has been done in that area. We took the work further because not every patient improved to the same extent. There was a lot of individual variability. So one of the variables we're interested in is whether there was a genetic-based difference in some patients, and you know from the work that Arti presented, that Sheba presented yesterday, that there are circadian clock genes that regulate the circadian cycle at a cellular level, and we know that polymorphisms in these genes result in different phenotypes and are thought to be a cause of circadian rhythm sleep disturbance in humans. So one of these genes is the period gene, the PER3 genes. So we looked at whether differences in the PER3 gene, which is implicated in delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, may account for differences in treatment effect. And we indeed found that those patients that had the longer allele of this gene had a different response to those who had the homozygous shorter allele. And so this suggested that really in the future, when you're trying to identify the appropriate patients that will benefit from melatonin treatment, there may be a kind of a pharmacogenomic approach to this treatment. I'll just skip over that. And we've also taken this work into other patients, just to give you an illustration of the fact that this is not just sleep disorder patients, but also these are patients that, this is Dr. Srikanth, the work I was telling you about, where we tested in traumatic brain injury patients, and they have a pattern of melatonin secretion where the melatonin rhythm is phase delayed and also dampened in amplitude. And so we thought that a melatonin intervention would be worth testing. And so we tested 2 milligrams prolonged release melatonin for sleep disturbance in this patient group, and we found significant benefits in a number of the sleep outcomes. And now we are doing the full cycle. I told you we started with melatonin in rats and mice and squirrels. Then we went to melatonin in humans. Then we studied tazemeltium in humans. And then I took it back to melatonin in delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. And now Vanda has come along and said, well, we now want to replicate your trial with tazemeltium. So that trial is now going on with the melatonin agonist as well. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful group at Monash. There's Sean Drummond over there as well, who have all contributed to this work, and also the Brigham and Women's Hospital and the University of Surrey, and all of the funding groups as well. Thank you. The forced synchrony protocol, this is where these data came from, showed that if you look at total sleep time, if you tried to put someone to sleep at all different phases of the circadian cycle, total sleep time would be pretty low at this phase here, which is in the evening, right? If you tried to put yourself to sleep at about 6 o'clock in the evening, your total sleep time would be much lower. It's highest when you sleep at the appropriate circadian phase, right? So what we do in these phase advanced protocols is that we move the sleep-wake cycle like this, right? And so we move it earlier by 5 hours, and as a result, we disrupt sleep. Total sleep time drops, the time taken to fall asleep increases, etc. So what we think is happening with this particular polymorphism, Dirk-Jan Dijk at the University of Surrey has shown that the longer allele of this PER3 gene has more rapid accumulation of homeostatic sleep pressure than the shorter allele. So what I think is happening is that when we phase advance the sleep-wake cycle, like this, where now the 5-5 homozygous PER3 individuals still have higher sleep pressure. So they have less problem initiating sleep at the phase advanced time than the 4-4 people. The 4-4 people have more sleep disturbance because they've got lower sleep pressure generally. So that's why we think that these patients benefit more from the melatonin treatment because, if you like, there's more opportunity for the drug to have a benefit because of the fact that their homeostatic sleep pressure is lower, their sleep is more disturbed when you try and move it forward. Does that make sense?
Is that DSWPD, it is a genetic disorder?
Right, okay, so that's a really important question. There is a higher prevalence of polymorphisms of a variety of these circadian clock genes in the phase disorders, PER2 in advanced sleep and PER3 in delayed sleep. Now I had a question earlier, which was a really good question, about the doses. You would have noticed that there was a dose difference between what we use for melatonin and what we're using for what's approved for tasonaltium. Do you remember what the approved FDA-approved dose for tasonaltium was? 20 milligrams. Excellent. Do you remember what I used for the DSWPD trial for melatonin?
10,
So that was someone else's. James Wyatt used the 0.3 and then 5. I used 0.5. Now, are there any pharmacologists in the room? Anyone doing their PhDs in pharmacology? We have Professor Sri that we'll have to talk to about this. But it's puzzling because why do we need 20 milligrams of the melatonin agonist and 0.5 milligrams of the naturally occurring hormone melatonin? When the melatonin agonist is supposed to have similar receptor affinity to melatonin. So it's going to be as potent as melatonin from a receptor. So it must be to do with the bioavailability once you take the drug. There must be less of the drug that's available, that has opportunity to have an effect. Otherwise, you wouldn't have such a massive difference in dose. So that's an important consideration, because from that point of view, if you were kind of doing a benefits and pros and cons of melatonin versus tasonaltium, you'd say, well, if the bioavailability appears to be higher with melatonin, that's a pro for melatonin. So it's a good question. Other questions?
So, I don't know if there is any data, but with the long-term use of melatonin, can it influence the receptors' availability or concentration?
There is no, firstly, long-term studies, there are a lack of long-term studies. There are few anecdotal examples where patients have been followed for very long periods. Vanda has done long-term follow-up of patients with tasonaltium. They're not finding any change in efficacy, so no one's, as far as I'm aware, studied receptors, but they've looked at efficacy and they've looked at endogenous melatonin levels and they've looked at pharmacokinetics, and they don't see a change over long-term use. But it's not being rigorously studied in long-term.
Ambient melatonin has to acquire the receptor.
Yeah, but there isn't any evidence that I'm aware of. Yes, I can.
So you mentioned that melatonin treatment for the different variants of melatonin. Is it showing effect on with the ones that are folded?
Yes.
But I remember a study where HER3 has been associated with seasonal winter kind of depressive behavior. So I was just wondering if the melatonin treatment will also pick them up from that depressive depression behavior that they observe in winter.
So, theoretically, yes. I think the problem is because the trials haven't been done where the patient's endogenous melatonin rhythm is firstly assessed to see if there really is a misalignment problem, and then the dose of melatonin isn't appropriately timed. It's just a noisy result. It's like what we were talking about earlier with agomelatine, for major depression, it's a fairly weak signal because I don't think the patients are well characterized and the timing of the treatment is not optimal. But if you were to do a trial where you brought patients in that had seasonal depression, measured symptoms, found when they are going into a depressive episode, measured their circadian melatonin rhythm, and then timed the melatonin treatment, I think then I would hypothesize that you would get a much stronger positive result by shifting and realigning the clock to the appropriate phase. But that hasn't been done. It's because they are difficult studies. They're difficult studies dealing with depressed patients to motivate them to participate in studies like this, to be able to then stay in the lab, take samples, etc. It's complex. We measured in our trials, we measured mood and we didn't find a significant effect. We didn't recruit patients that had depressed mood. So it's a bit hard to know whether that was because the patients weren't depressed or whether the drug doesn't have an effect on depressive symptoms. It could be like a ceiling effect where they weren't really depressed, so there wasn't really enough room to show an improvement. No effect on those aspects. The only subjective outcomes that we really looked at in detail and we powered the study for were daytime disruption of so that was the prone sleep-related impairment, the insomnia severity index, those sorts of subjective measures. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. On which patient? Coronary artery disease. Mm-hmm. Yes. Dipping pattern, yes. Yeah.
So finally, we have not made a very detailed conclusion because at that time we were not having so much of study protocols and the statement which the study they concluded was either there was two parties, either it was this dipping pattern which the patients became not desensitized, either it was something happened in the receptors of melatonin, or either due to the
Response. Yeah.
So, what can you say?
I can say that there are a number of effects of melatonin apart from the ones I've shown. I've talked about the sleep promoting effects. I've talked about the circadian phase shifting effects. There are the antioxidant effects that are important and anti-inflammatory. And also the antihypertensive effect is pretty well documented now. So that increase in, the lowering of nocturnal blood pressure is an important additional benefit of melatonin. And some trials have been done. Frank Shear has done, I think in his PhD, did trials of melatonin to reduce blood pressure in patients with high blood pressure. And so I'm not sure of the mechanism, I don't know the area well enough, but I know that it's a fairly well-established phenomenon. The other, which picks up on what Sean Drummond was talking about, was that, remember how we were talking about wearing warm socks to try and increase your peripheral vasodilation, reduce core temperature. Melatonin has a hypothermic effect as well. It reduces core temperature and increases peripheral vasodilation. It has the same effect as the salts. So that's another important property because it's giving you a mechanism through which it might be inducing sleep because it's pushing temperature down, core temperature, and it's increasing peripheral temperature.
Said that the dark chocolate will also promote sleep, dark chocolates. So,
Dark chocolates.
Is that something to do with the
I
melatonin?
don't know the answer to that one. I don't know what the caffeine content in dark chocolate is. Not sure. Not one that I've heard of.
Mood elevator.
I would have thought that it would have, I don't know. I don't know what the caffeine content is. Does anyone know what the caffeine content is? Dark chocolate? Yeah, it must be. Yes.
It's variable, I guess.
Yeah, it must be very, very.
So this is just out of curiosity. Any comment that you would want to make on the different prototypes? Apart from the lab and all, there have been a lot of prototypes in the lab. So do you have any evidence-based classification? Or is it just
I think it's become.
generalizing?
I think the most accepted or validated that I'm aware of is the Larkinau or the the morningness, eveningness, Horn-Osberg, or the Munich. Those are the ones that are well validated against physiological measures and proper questionnaires that you can assess the constructs with.
So, curiosity-based question. So, I was wondering if melatonin doesn't go hand in hand with some other kind of dog-based patients, like other psychiatric disease patients. So, and melatonin is not preferred for them. Is there any disease or patients like that? You don't
Oh,
want to
like it's a contraindication type situation? Like you wouldn't give it?
Yes.
I mean, I don't think so. I don't think people who are pregnant, you wouldn't, because again, it has these interactions with the reproductive axis that we don't quite understand.
I mean, any dog-based disease.
I don't think so. I've not heard of a condition that could be made worse by melatonin administration. Okay, well, I thank you all for your attention. Now, so tomorrow we're going to move away from talking about. So I've tried to kind of follow the logic of the fundamental properties of the circadian system, how it kind of impacts upon the most common clinical conditions that we talk about, which is the circadian rhythm, sleep-wake disorders. And then we've kind of followed that on with how do we treat those disorders. Tomorrow we're going to talk about shift work. And I started talking about that today, and I rushed through it because we're going to talk about it in much more detail. It's, if you like, a perfect storm of circadian rhythm and sleep-wake disruption. And then it causes a number of adverse health consequences. So, and I said in my first lecture that I think there's a lot of scope, particularly in India, to do work in this area, because I think there is a high burden of disease, particularly in hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on, and probably a burgeoning problem with mood disorders as well in people who are working disrupted kind of work schedules. So I'd love for, that's why I wanted to spend a whole lecture just talking about that shift work problem. And a number of you have actually come and talked to me about shift work related scenarios as well. So that's what we'll pick up tomorrow. And and I look forward to, in the meantime, if you've got any questions and so on, you're welcome to come and talk to me. Thank you all. Hopefully you get some lights here before Sunday.